I want to start this talk by trying to make sure we're all on the same level of information, basic information about Greece. There's a good article in Workers' World about Greece, a short profile, and it shows that Greece is a very developed country, actually, small, 11 million people, but it's a major country in the capitalist establishment. It has the largest merchant navy in the world. It has 15% of the global tonnage in its ship capacity. It has banks. These banks are all over Southern Europe, in Romania, Serbia, Macedonia, Yugoslavia. They're an imperialist country, but they're small and they're dominated by the bigger imperialist countries. Their telecommunications industry has a lot of investment in the same Southern European region, and they trade a great deal with these poorer countries in Southern Europe. They have a long history of struggle in Greece. They fought a civil war from 1946 to 1949, in which they were defeated through the intervention of the imperialists, first the British imperialists and then the US imperialists. It was a heroic war for independence and really for socialism. So I just wanted to bring that up so people are on the same page about Greece as a country. It's 11 million. Did I mention it's a population of 11 million? Yeah. Now, I want to say a few words about Syriza, because that's important. Syriza is a coalition. It's a party, but it originates as a coalition. And the center of this coalition is an organization who I hope I can pronounce their name, Synaspismos. That is Cyprus's party. That's the centerpiece of this coalition. There are Maoist organizations, some Trotskyist organizations, some communist ecological organizations, and generally it's filled with leftists of one sort or another. It's not a solid party like, say, the Greek Communist Party, which is a solid cadre party, built up on classical lines, based upon the industrial proletariat. Syriza is not like this at all. It's a little bit amorphous. It has a lot. It's an urban party primarily, although in this last election, they got a big support from the rural areas, who are suffering terribly. So, the party of Cyprus, I can't pronounce, Synapsism, say it?
Synaspismos.
Synaspismos, thank you, the European expert here. They have origins in the communist movement, but in the right wing of the communist movement, when it was breaking up after the collapse of the USSR. They were formed in '91, and it was part of their party was the Euro-communist section of the Communist Party, which Euro-communism, you should read the pamphlet by Sam Marcy on Euro-communism. I could not use my time just to talk about that, but suffice it to say, it was a trend in Europe that broke ties with the USSR and, cut off international solidarity with the Soviet Union. And they were called Euro-communists, nationalist in a lot of ways. That, and of course the present-day Greek Communist Party represents the current that resisted this, Although they split, Eurocommunism split from the Greek Communist Party. So they stood firm on this, on class loyalty to the class camp of the socialist camp. So you can see that there's a lot of bad blood there. And uniting is very difficult. And so, right now, they're very separate in the middle of this big crisis, which calls for a united, struggle. Syriza has a large youth section. They were formed in 2004, by the way. They have a large youth section. They have taken all the, not all, but probably most of the Occupy youth. They call it the people in the square in Greece. It's called people in the square. They've taken the anti-globalization movement. They've taken people from the lesbian and gay, bi, trans movement. They've anti-racist movement especially. And these are all under the Syriza umbrella. And they're beginning to organize. They went to the countryside to help the farmers survive. In Greece, people were foraging in the forest for food. That's how bad it was in Greece. Living through garbage dumps for food. This is a developed country. Now, following the economic crisis, by 2009, Greece was falling into a recession, and they could not pay, the Greek government could not pay off the loans made to it by other governments. When it sold bonds to those governments to get money, they couldn't pay back the money to redeem the bonds. A bond is a loan. You sell a bond by a government, they're borrowing money from whoever buys it, a private investor or a government or a bank, whatever. It's a loan, and you have to pay it back by a certain term. Bonds have a time frame on them and an interest rate that goes with it. And by 2010, they couldn't pay. They didn't have the money. The treasury was empty. And they had the Greek government at that time, Papandreou, asked for a bailout. So in May 2010, they got a bailout. And it's from a group called the Troika. In connection with Greece, you'll hear the Troika. What is the Troika? It's the European Central Bank, which is the bank of bankers in Europe. It's the European Commission, which is the ministers from all the countries in Europe. And it's the IMF. Now, what's not spoken about very much is that this banking grouping, the Troika, is really a coalition between the United States and the European bankers, because the IMF is controlled by the United States. Don't ever forget it. And when they sit around the table and they're talking about how we're going to put the screws on Greece and whether to loosen them up a little bit here and there, the U.S. bankers who have the greatest weight in the IMF because they contribute the most money, and you get your votes according to the amount of money you contribute, they have their say. But nobody talks much about that. It's in the background. So when the Greek crisis broke out, and Syriza was elected, and all the European bankers took a hard line. Right away, they said no. Angela Merkel, within 24 hours, as the president of Germany, which is the biggest contributor to the European Central Bank. Just like the U.S. is the biggest contributor to the IMF, the German imperialists are the biggest contributors to the European Central Bank. And anything that happens to the central bank, they consider that to be their money, and they guard it like any banker guards their money. So they immediately issued a statement saying Greece has to pay their debts. Doesn't matter about an election. And Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the International Monetary Fund, had the audacity to give an interview to the London Guardian in which she said, well, it's payback time. That's it. You got to pay. Greek parents, they got to pay their taxes. That's all there is to it. That's the voice of the U.S. and the European bankers and a coalition of them. I mean, the Europeans are the big weight in all this. I don't want to overdo it. But the voice of the United States is in it, and nobody really discusses that. Although the Greeks know. They know. But it's been kept secret or quiet by the capitalist press all over the world. So the first bailout came in May of 2010, and it was for 80 billion euro. I think that's like $90 billion or something. And it was supposed to go for 3 years. But by 2012, it was clear they weren't going to be able to pay off anything. The austerity was bringing the economy down itself, and the world conditions were bringing the economy down. And they were in worse debt 2 years after the bailout than they were before the bailout. So they had to step in and issue a second bailout. What they do when they do these bailouts, they call up a memorandum of understanding, which the Greek government has to sign. A memorandum of understanding is a very innocuous name for a set of onerous conditions that are inviolable, laid out by the bankers, that the debtor agrees to, which is the Greek government. So they had the first memorandum of understanding for the 80 billion, and then they added another 160 billion the second time, because it got worse. They had to almost double the amount. No, actually they did double the amount. So by 2013, I'll get to that in a minute. The Greek economy was in a depression that's as deep as the United States Depression of the 1930s. They had a collapse of their economy of 26%. In the 1930s, the U.S. economy collapsed 25%. That's the degree of devastation. And you remember the Hoovervilles, and everybody living out in tents and living out in shacks and so on. Well, that's the way it is in Greece. So what were the conditions of the bailout? There's 3 points. The first point is austerity. By austerity, it means cut government spending for social services and cut government workers. That's what it means. Cut the budget. Cut the budget. Don't cut our part. Don't cut the bankers' part. Don't cut the corporations' part. Cut the masses' part. Cut hospitals, health care. Cut all kinds of infrastructure. Cut the postal service. Cut transportation. Cut everything. And lay off government workers. That's austerity part. The other part is the so-called restructuring part. That's the second part. Restructuring means cut the workers, change the labor law, suspend labor agreements, cut the minimum wage, forget the minimum wage, go below sub-minimum wage. eradicate that, and fire people. That's what they call labor structural reform. That's the second condition. And it's written there. That's what they got to do. And the third one is to privatize all the public facilities and sell them to capitalists. Raise the money to pay the debt back to the banks. For all you know, they could sell it to a bank and then use the money to pay the bank back. You know, that's a joke, but that's really what it's about. So that we're going to sell off the two biggest ports in the country, the biggest airports in the country, the telegraph, the electric power facility in the country, and a number of other things I can't remember right now. It's in the article, by the way. Okay. So what was the result of all this bailout? The result was that there's now 26% or 25% unemployment in Greece, 50% youth unemployment in Greece. Half the population lives below the poverty level in Greece. And that is the result of a bailout. Now you would think, getting all of these, well, they didn't get it all, 240 billion euro, or $270 billion, you would think, well, by now, everybody would be better off. But it wasn't the Greek people that got bailed out. 90% of that money, as the Greek finance minister pointed out, Varoufakis is his name, Varoufakis. He said 90% of that money was used to pay the banks. It never went to the Greek people. It was recycling money through Greece and taking money from the workers and the masses and from everything that they needed and shoveling it back to the banks. Because the debts were owed to the banks. So the money was loaned on the condition of taking all these cuts so that they could take the money and give it to the banks. It's a big scam. The same happened in Detroit. Same thing. Because it gets recycled. All the money that J.P. Morgan and Chase and all the rest of them put into Detroit. And then Detroit can't pay back, so they declare bankruptcy, so then they have to cut the budget so that they can pay J.P. Morgan Chase. So that's the way it went in Greece. So the Greek masses paid for this. The debt is illegitimate. It's not legitimate. They didn't, first of all, ask for the money. The government did. The bourgeois capitalist government of Papandreou and the guy who came after him went and got on their knees and signed. The Greek people didn't sign. The workers didn't sign. It's rotten government, bourgeois government signed in the first place. And in the second place, they never got the money. The people never got the money anyway. So the debt is wholly illegitimate, even from a bourgeois point of view. Forget about socialism. Forget about the fact that these are bankers and we shouldn't have to pay them anything anywhere and they shouldn't even exist. Forget about that. And we should get rid of every one of them in the appropriate way. But even from a bourgeois point of view, this debt is completely illegitimate, and that has to become into the bones of the people. Now, Syriza won the election with a significant amount. I got it somewhere. They got 36%. The big bourgeois party after them, New Democracy, got 27%. The Greek Communist Party got 5.5%, I think. Golden Dawn got 6. That's a fascist party. Golden Dawn. Half their leadership is in jail now. They got 6.3% of the vote. So they came in on an anti-austerity program, and they fought it pretty hard. They can call them whatever you want to call them, but they took the helm in a big crisis situation. They now have to go up against all the bankers of Europe and the IMF. And they got a situation. And we better respect it and try to find a way to help the situation rather than to sit around and criticize them. Thank you. They deserve plenty of criticism as a critique. They are social democrats. They're not trying to overthrow capitalism. That's not part of what they're about. They're left social democrats. There's plenty of Marxists in here, by the way. And there's a left in Syriza. It's called the Left Platform, which is very worried about Cyprus. But what's the contradiction that arises out of this? The contradiction is that Syriza is wedded to crush the austerity program and roll it back. On the other hand, they know, or they say they know, that they have to have a deal with the European bankers. Now, those two things may be incompatible. They may be. Depends on the relationship of forces. But the relationship of forces right now is very much against Greece and the Greek government, very much against it. I mean, Syriza has already defied the Troika. When they got in, they restored the minimum wage to what it was before. They rehired all the women who had been picketing and demonstrating in front of the parliament for probably over a year. They all got fired as part of the austerity program. They rehired them. The barricades came down from the front of the parliament building. They restored the pensions. They restored the right of immigrant children to have rights. If they're born in Greece and they're immigrants, they have rights. They canceled privatization plans to sell the Piraeus port, the famous historic Piraeus port. You read about it in school. And all of these airports and railroads and electric companies and so on, they canceled it. And they didn't ask permission. Now, when you owe somebody $240 billion and you're going to change the terms, you're supposed to ask them permission. They didn't ask permission. They just did it within days of the election. That's throwing down the gauntlet to the bankers. The bankers say, no, you have to agree and abide by the Memorandum of Understanding. This tears up the Memorandum of Understanding. Also, they said, we're not going to talk to the Troika. In other words, this little hardcore group of bankers who have congealed into a small elite committee from the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Commission. They said, we're not going to deal with them. We're only going to deal with individual European governments. That is already a kick in the teeth. But the question is, how much can they uphold? That's the issue. By doing these anti-austerity measures, they have back themselves into a situation which is not going to be very easy to reverse in front of the masses. They're committed, not to something in the future, but to something they already did. I don't know if they thought it through, but whatever. They felt that was the right thing to do, and they did it. So they have a view of this. They're going to try to encircle the Germans. That was their strategy, the German imperialists. They were going to go to... And this is where they're creating illusions. And Syriza himself is creating illusions by saying there's wiggle room, we think we have some friendly attitudes that we have detected over there, even in the head of the central bank, or in Hollande in France, or in Italy, or in London. Because they know that there is a lot of hostility towards Merkel because of her iron-fisted austerity program. And there's a lot of people who think it's utterly unreasonable, including Obama. He said it himself. But when they went to bring their program, which was, it's not fully developed, was they want to cut the debt in half, just write it off. They want to change the terms of repayment to lower the interest rates, to stretch out the terms of payment, to make the payments conditional on economic growth so that they'll have some money to use to pay back. That's what they came with. And then the finance minister even put out that, well, instead of the debt, let's convert it into bonds, that long-term bonds that we give to the debtors, to the creditors, and we'll pay it off over a period of time. This happened in Latin America in the 1980s. They did this. But when they got there, he went first to France, and France said, Hollande said, well, that wasn't Hollande. It was the finance minister. I forgot his name. He says, well, we sympathize with you, and we'll see what we can do about easing the terms of the loans. But no debt forgiveness. Never. Then they went to, I think, Rome. And they brought it up there, and the same thing happened. Then they went to London. The same thing, they got the same answer. Finally, they went to Berlin, and of course, they were turned down flat. The London, and I guess the finance ministers of Europe got together in Brussels and had a preliminary discussion of all this. And the London Guardian wrote, it was 18-1 against Greece. 18-1. So now you think, put yourself over there. You're pledged to austerity. The masses want austerity. They're out in the streets demonstrating. I saw a demonstration today. I mean, against austerity. They were demonstrating today. A big, huge demonstration outside the Parliament building. Because now the Syriza's in the Parliament. So it was a friendly demonstration. But this is the dilemma. The relationship of forces is terribly unfavorable. See, and there's a kind of a tragic division between the Greek Communist Party and Syriza. It's a historical thing. Because the Greeks have the strength, the Greek CP. They have the industrial base and the strength to put a lot of muscle into this movement. As I said before, Syriza is not a solid party. Like, it's not a cadre party. And it's somewhat amorphous. And it hasn't got a firm ideology. It's all over the place. So what is needed is to change this from a financial discussion between governments to a struggle in the streets and the factories and the fields to cancel the debt and to end the austerity. Forget about socialism for the moment. End the austerity. That's the slogan. No more austerity. No more troika. Cancel the debt. Put everybody back to work. No more. Enough. We won't pay. It's your problem. It's not our problem. That has to become a united sentiment among all the parties, especially the revolutionary parties, to bring the masses over to the left. Because there's got to be a plan B. Syriza and Rav Lucas are going around Europe and trying to say we want to be with Europe, we want to be in Europe, we want to end the austerity, but we don't want to break up the Europe, we don't want to leave the Eurozone, we want to be part of Europe. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. Now you can say that's a defensive maneuver, and you may be right, to kind of relax the imperialists, because the situation is dire. But you got to take the other side of that, because the masses are listening to you. They're listening to what you say. And if you tell them that we hear friendly voices in Europe, you're helping them to underestimate their enemy and to misunderstand their enemy. You want to go in the other direction. If anything, you want to overestimate the enemy and prepare hard and strong for that. And if you don't prepare the masses, you throw away all the leverage you have in the struggle. Because that's the only leverage they have. They certainly ain't got money. They got no. Russia's far away. I don't even know if the Putin's going to help them or not going to help them. The Chinese have been friendly because they were supposed to run the Piraeus port, and they said, no, we're not pulling out, we're going to stick with you. But that's a small thing. This is Europe. This has got to be within Europe that they're going to have to get their aid and assistance. So it's a difficult situation, and they shouldn't be going around disarming the people by sowing illusions about these bankers. And they shouldn't fool themselves. They shouldn't fool themselves. That's the worst thing that could happen. For the leaders to fool themselves. Once you start a struggle like this, you got to think it through to the end. What is the end? What are the stages of this? And by the way, this is a crisis that's on a, fast track. Because there are financial deadlines, and bankers want their money, and they want it in full by said date. So there's a meeting on February 11th of the finance ministers in Europe. The whole bailout program ends on the 28th of February. It ends. And just to make sure everybody knows this, yesterday, the European Central Bank cut off all credit to the Greek banks, the private banks in Greece. Not all credit, but cheap credit, which they needed. I won't go into this, it's a technical thing. But they were entitled to get money from the Greek Central Bank as loans, cheap loans, as long as they abide by a memorandum of understanding. But they've been declared to not be abiding by the memorandum of understanding, and the European Central Bank playing hardball just when the finance minister has been going around Europe and said, no more credit, no more cheap credit for the banks in Greece. Now that may have symbolic significance, or it may have a big monetary significance. I don't know. But it's a message. They're playing hardball. So there's got to be a way. The struggle has to get beyond the parliament. I mean, there have to be laws made in the parliament against the troika, against austerity, to restore the masses to a decent condition. That has to be done parliamentarily. But the struggle can't just be in the parliament. It's got to be in the streets. And also, see, let me just say this. While the election was going on, before it was finished, the right wing, the New Democratic Party, which was the main bourgeois party, they were putting pictures out of Venezuela with long lines for the food and empty shelves. They were floating it all over the place. If Syriza gets in, this is what's going to happen. Why? Because they're going to leave the euro. They're going to say, we can't deal with euros. We are not even a sovereign country. We have a government, but our treasury is in Frankfurt. We can't do anything unless Frankfurt gives us money and approves of it. And Frankfurt is the center of German finance capital. They're not even a sovereign country. And the right wing knows that people are going to wake up to this. And sooner or later, rather than be crushed by the demands by the German and the French and the Dutch and the Finns and the Danes for every last euro they got, they'll say, to hell with you, we're not going to use that euro anymore. We're going to go back to the old Greek drachma. We can print as many as we want, and we'll pay you off in that, if you like it. Now, what is it? What is that? It holds out the prospect that all of Europe will unite to financially strangle them. Ooh, 35 minutes? You were supposed to tell me before that. Oh, I'm sorry. I got lost here. But thank you. But anyway, I'll wrap up. So the point is this. They have to be ready to deal with financial strangulation. If they have to, they'd be forced out of the Eurozone, forced off the euro, then the next thing is to be forced out of the European Union. See, and become totally isolated. And they have to find a way to get the masses ready for this eventuality and not delude themselves that this is not a variant of the situation. They can't fool themselves, and they shouldn't fool the people, and they should be ready. There's plenty of Greek farmers. 12% of the labor force is agricultural, by the way. They know how to grow food, all kinds of food. They're experts at it. They know how to do all kinds of industrial things. They have an industrial proletariat. They have to be ready. Now, you know, this could be a struggle that you can't win, but you have to wage it anyway. We don't know how it's going to come out. We don't know how far it's going to go. But we just know that we have to, if we were there, we would find a way. If we got 6% of the vote or 5%, and Syriza got 36% of the vote, we would know that we have to get close to them because the masses are following them on the basis of fighting back. And we want to show that we're part of that and that we're with it, but we'll have our own program, which I just alluded to before about the debt and all that. See, some people like the Greek Communist Party, they analyzed the election. I read their analysis of it. I won't go into what their analysis is. It was pretty much a hostile analysis. But here's what they should have pointed out and figured out right away. In the elections, Syriza gained 9 percentage points over their previous vote. They got 2 million plus, I forgot how much it was. The important thing is that PASOK, which is the Socialist Party of Greece, which was the right-wing Social Democrats who participated in giving all this money to the bankers, they lost 7%. So the right-wing Social Democrats lost 7%, and the left-wing Social Democrats gained 9%. What does that tell you? If you're going to make an analysis, start with something real, not with abstract historical arguments. The masses are moving to the left. They're moving from the right-wing social because they voted for the socialists. They voted them in. And now they voted them out and voted Syriza in, which is a leftist formation. So if the masses are moving to the left, that's our signal to get into the struggle and embrace it and find a way to make inroads. And if Syriza should be overcome by the bankers and start to back up, then we can get in and not back up and show the people we're not going to let austerity come back. No matter what the bankers say, we're going to fight to the end. There's no other way. That would be an analysis of what's going on in Greece right now. There's a swing to the left. They even got votes in the rural areas which are conservative, because they sent youths into the countryside to help the farmers deal with the crushing poverty. So we want to swim in this stream of leftism that's sweeping the youth and the workers and the farmers and the petty bourgeoisie. And that's the only way to find unity in the struggle in the streets and be prepared for the final struggle, whatever the showdown comes, when it comes, at whatever stage. That's it. Venezuela, it's the natural thing to make a comparison, because they're both small countries and they're both being strangled by imperialism. I think that they're different in this way. Chavez had the army with him. Helps a lot. Plus he had a lot of oil under the ground. That gave them tremendous staying power. I don't want to underestimate the role of the masses. Not at all. Chavez pulled them into the struggle. They didn't pull him. He pulled them. But he helped them to raise their consciousness and to get organized and to raise their political development. But what Rebecca said is true, like about Greece and Venezuela. They didn't never let up, and we really should be talking about Venezuela, soon. It's because they haven't got their finger off their hands around the throat of the revolution, and they're trying to squeeze. The two things that are somewhat related is Syriza showed an opportunist side when they made the alliance with the independent Greeks. The independent Greeks are a right-wing party. They needed that for a parliamentary majority to ensure it. And that party is sort of friendly to the military. And they gave them the defense ministry. That's like giving the generals a seat at the cabinet. That was terrible. Also, they're anti-immigrant, they're anti-gay, and It doesn't help Syriza, I'll tell you that. They may have a parliamentary majority, but it's flawed. It's flawed and it's marred by this rotten opportunist alliance, which should never have been made. But it also goes along with the Golden Dawn people. I didn't bring it up, but it's a factor in the situation. We don't know how much of a factor. They lost a little bit in this election. But if this whole endeavor should, in the long run, collapse, and austerity should be reimposed, it has the ingredients of helping to spawn either Golden Dawn or some other right-wing forces. And Greece has a lot of immigrants. 20% of the workforce is immigrants. And Golden Dawn has made their reputation by going in immigrant neighborhoods armed and beating people up and killing them. Their leadership, by the way, is in jail now. Golden Dawn. Cops. By the way, see, I was reading an interview with somebody from Syriza, and he said we're worried about the military, but we're more worried about the police. Because when they arrested the leaders, some of them were with the police. So they're there. Which leads me to another point, is that this is still a capitalist state. Don't forget that. The army is still there, the police are still there, wage slavery is still there, even though if it becomes more moderated, less extreme. Capitalist relations prevail. When the Greeks say that Syriza is helping, defending capitalism, there's something to it. There's something to it. But that's not their intent. Their intent is to make an assault on capitalist austerity. And that's what they're engaged in. And like Larry said, when you throw a stone and start a fight, you don't know how it's going to come out. And that's what's important. The fight is what's important right now. You need to have your program, though. You need to have a program in there. And that's what communists do, is to have a program, but the tone in which you approach this makes the difference between failure and success. Because the tone that the masses hear is very important. They want to hear, are you baiting us? Are you waiting for us to fail? Or are you with us? If the tone doesn't express that, then all the politics in the world will go out the window. Even if it's beautiful, pristine, signed by Lenin. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You've got to have the right approach. The art of politics is important. Now, on the international solidarity, I've thought about this a lot. I met one of the Greek communists in Brazil, and I asked him about this, about the Southern. Everybody's been thinking about it, about a Southern Alliance, Southern European Alliance plus Ireland. Plus Ireland. Now it's plus Cyprus, too. And I met somebody from the Portuguese communist movement, and I raised it with him. I didn't get anything. So I with the Greeks, I raised it with the Spanish and with the Portuguese. And for some reason, I don't know why, nobody picked up on it. Nobody. Now, that doesn't mean they won't. And Podemos may push everybody. See? Podemos may push everybody. But the problem the Greeks have is timing. Timing is so important in politics. Building international solidarity and an international network of solidarity takes a little time. And we should pursue it. And we should pursue it with a vengeance. But the question of timing, they are not in a position to rely on it right now. See, the Bolsheviks were waiting for the German Revolution. And it failed in 1918-19. And then it failed in 1923. But they had the luxury of waiting to see if it would happen, and meanwhile building and building and building. But they don't have time in Greece now. It's like, what's going to happen if somebody's going to say no? That may come soon. That may come soon, and it's going to be, are you going to... Somebody wrote an article, somebody from Syriza, who lives in the United States. He's on the Central Committee. And he wrote an article called Confrontation or Capitulation. And he was worried about some of the formulations of leadership. And he's on the Central Committee. But that's what it's going to be about. Oh, let's put it this way. You have to seriously prepare in that way. It's going to be confrontation or capitulation. You can't get the banks to do anything unless you confront them. You can make the best argument in the world. It's like talking to the wall. So it's going to take some form of confrontation in order to move this thing, move the needle on this from our side. That's not to say it will be successful. That's not to say it's easy. But it's necessary. And if we don't pursue it, we're not going to get anywhere at all. So timing, but time is not on our side. Syriza has not prepared the masses for this kind of struggle. And they're not, like the Greek party, a revolutionary party, which at least in their history, in their understanding, has a sense of what should be done. Whether they're going to do it or not is another story, but they know what should be done, and they have the capability. But Syriza has the majority of the masses. And so it's a tough responsibility for them. And like Larry said, if you're not out there in the struggle, you're weakening their position against austerity. And you don't want to do that. You want to strengthen their position against austerity by mass pressure. Mass pressure. So anyway, Russia is a difficult problem. You know, there's a vote for sanctions in the European Union, and there has to be a full consensus. And the Greeks could sink it by voting no. I don't know if the vote has happened yet. I've heard two different versions, that they did and that they didn't, and they will and that they won't. And I don't know.
February 11th.
Is it February 11th? But listen, see, you got to think about, here you are, you want to fight Europe on the debt. And Europe is invested in the sanctions, and the U.S. wants these sanctions. They're going to, we want sanctions, and so Merkel and all of them are with sanctions. So you got to say, well, can we fight this fight and the fight against austerity too? It isn't easy. It's a principled thing to do it right, but put yourself over there. All of a sudden, you'll be anti-European, pro-Putin. Meanwhile, they're going to change the subject, you know. Meanwhile, you're trying to make them back up on the debt. So it's difficult. It's difficult. Politics isn't easy, especially when you're on the short end of the stick, you know, which the Greeks are. So there's all kinds of problems. The Ukraine sanctions, NATO, by the way, NATO. They're waffling over the question of whether to stay in NATO again or not. I mean, Syriza. That's really important. on the question of military spending, I mean, it's true that the Greeks are the second largest by proportion purchasers of military equipment within NATO. Only the U.S. is first. But they were able to do this before the world capitalist economic crisis brought them down. So I think it would be misplaced to say that military spending brought this crisis on and could have been avoided without it. This crisis is caused by the banks and the world capitalist crisis. Military spending aggravates it, just like everything, like interest payments aggravate it. You know, but let's put the focus on the central issue here: the world capitalist crisis and the bankers' predatory approach to austerity and squeezing every nickel out of everybody. That's really what it is. And military spending makes it worse. And it's true, the Greek military is a great purchaser of US and British and German military equipment. But it isn't decisive in creating this crisis. And it would be a mistake to put too much emphasis on it. That's about it.